I'm speaking in good faith today with Dr. Brian Grimm, who's the founding president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. He works with Fortune 500 companies, including religion and belief, as part of their diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives. And he's regarded as the leading expert on the positive socio-economic impact of freedom of religion and belief for all. That is a whole new concept to me. So I'm going to get to that about, seriously, that helps our
Yeah,
economy. I want to know more.
yeah,
So first of all, thank you, Brian, for speaking with me today. You're speaking from your home near Annapolis, Maryland. And
that's
I'm
right.
very lucky to have you. I'm just going to fill in a little bit that you've been the chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on the Role of Faith, a Davos speaker, TEDx speaker at the Vatican, director of Global Religion Data Research at the Pew Research Center, highly respected, and then author of academic articles and books, have taught in the Soviet Union, China, Central Asia, the Middle. Maybe we should have a list of where you have not yet taught. And so, and now you can add Provo, Utah to your list since we're connecting that way.
That's good.
I wonder if you would talk to me just about the origins of your faith life. Did you grow up in a home where that was a definite part of the upbringing?
Well, really, my faith journey began at an Evangelical United Brethren church in South Central Pennsylvania. It was a part of Pennsylvania that was mostly German speaking up to World War One, and
Hmm.
so we had a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch and Brethren type churches. And my earliest really calling and encounter with God was when I was 4 years old, looking out the window of my bedroom, and I saw the face of Jesus come and say, "Brian, be a missionary." And just as clear, I mean, just as clear as your face is on this,
Yeah.
we're zooming with each other. And then his face went away, and that wasn't very specific, and yet it's guided my life from that moment on. And it's, as you think of, within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I was Evangelical United Brethren, became Methodist, became Baptist, now I'm Catholic. Missionary has a different connotation in all of those different denominations, different backgrounds. So it's really been a process of trying to understand what that calling is all along life's journey. So that's really seeking God at different moments, listening for His voice and doing my best to follow it. So that's been my journey. I feel like I've done that successfully sometimes, and other times I've not been as successful. But it's that calling that keeps me going.
I feel like we could almost have a whole podcast just with me asking follow-up questions to what you've just told me about. 4 is really early, but you knew who you'd been spoken to by.
I did, and I remember, soon afterwards we had a Sunday school lesson, and the teacher was saying, well, you need to, something like you need to commit your lives to Jesus, or to make sure you have eternal salvation, and because you don't know if you're going to be alive tomorrow. You need to
Mm-hmm.
take action today. And I remember telling her, well, no, I know I'm going to be alive tomorrow because I've been called to be a missionary. And so it was, I knew it was Jesus. I knew it was the calling, but again, it wasn't very specific. And so what I'm doing now, as you introduced me, working on the economic benefits of religious freedom for everyone, including people that don't have a religious faith. That journey came about as I worked in different kinds of mission callings through the years, and seeing just how important it is, because I've changed my own faith, and I've gotten to know many Latter-day Saints, many of your audience, and have been to BYU, and I've had the opportunity to meet many of the senior brethren in your church. And so, there's a great respect there, but, that's a journey, because it's not a given that we appreciate each other's backgrounds from different faiths and beliefs that don't share our own.
Mm.
So I think that calling keeps calling me into new encounters and new ways and a new importance of why it's so important that each of us has that freedom to find and follow God.
Yeah. Which freedom you have been able to exercise when you felt a change or a call to a new place, a different denomination.
Yeah, yeah, and it was, different decisions along the way, and the one, now being Catholic, I guess, we've my wife and I became Catholic at the same time in 1994, which is a lot of years. That's, what is that now, 30 years ago. And so that one has stuck. But we were Baptists for a while, Baptist missionaries, and then before that Methodists. And at each stage, it was just trying to discern God's calling, and then where was the best home for us. In the Catholic Church, even though people from the outside look at the Catholic Church and see it as very monolithic, you've got your
Hmm.
congregations and your pastors, priests, and then your bishops, and then archbishops and cardinals and the Pope, and that seems like that's pretty uniform. But within the Catholic Church, there's so much diversity. There's Jesuits and Dominicans and all kinds of orders and different expressions. There's the Catholic charismatic movement that is very evangelical, you could say, in its spirit. And then you have contemplative and conservative,
Yes.
quiet Catholicism. So I think that's part of what that I've found is just having that diversity within a faith allows so much more expression, and you can sort of find a niche that is where you feel at home, and that's what I've found within my own journey.
Well, just even in the town next to mine, there is St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church that has both an English and a Spanish speaking congregation. And I've been impressed that they're all Catholics, but the services are not the same.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the liturgy is the same, but the
Yeah.
expression of it is very different, and then just the social life and that the fellowship that you feel is can be very different from congregation to congregation. But then that sense of being one in faith is shared by all.
Did you have a sense? I'm think you tell me if I'm right or wrong on this. I'm imagining if I had had an experience like you did, that I would think, oh, God really does talk to us, like people say, answers prayers. So I think I would just have this expectation that this will be an ongoing thing and that I'm going to be hearing from God at certain points in my life. And what has that been like for you?
Well, it isn't that way.
Hmm.
That's an exceptional experience, not a day to day. Maybe some people do have day to day experiences like that, but mine, it's been like probably the most people that, you're looking for God's leadership
Mm.
in speaking within your heart and in the circumstances and those around you, and the abilities and gifts He gives you, opportunities. Um, but I think, when you have a very unique calling like that, then it sets up an expectation of, especially in the Protestant, I was raised
Hmm.
Protestant and grew up in that church. People look to success, so to speak, for religious leaders, and it's like Billy Graham or,
Mm.
these people that become mega church pastors and famous. And so in my mind, I thought, well, that must be, that's the road I'm on. And that wasn't. And I think that um, sort of in the Protestant background I came from, it's, when there's difficulties and tragedy and things that don't work out, that's often interpreted as a sign, well, you're not really discerning God's way. Whereas in the Catholic way, when you're encountering difficulties and suffering, that may be the very sign that you're on God's track.
Mm.
And so I think it was that, because working, in the Soviet Union, working in Muslim majority areas, working in communist, very staunch communist areas in those days, was many trials and tribulations and setbacks. And I saw that when there were failures, that was often God moving, moving, and it may have been for my own development, or it may have been to move something in a different direction. And the Catholic understanding of suffering and failure, and that all of that is part of what we're to expect. If Jesus was, crucified, he was, beaten, he was, put to death, that, he didn't have a success journey of becoming a Billy Graham, right? So, I think that's where in the Catholic faith, it embraces that idea. And even in the symbolism, you mentioned the St. Francis of Assisi Church, you'll see in the front of the church that there's a cross with Christ, on the cross. And it's just a reminder that the true sign of a Christian, a faithful Christian pilgrimage is going to be a cross, that you're going to have crosses to bear and suffering. And that, and so that, that's something different than the Protestants have an empty cross, there's the celebration, but the Catholics continue to see in the trials that everyone has is that that's part of that working of God in our lives.
Brian, thank you so much for being so willing to share your journey. I think it's interesting that as you consider, is this a sign things aren't going well, or is God turning me in a different direction? In a way, you are your own interfaith counsel.
Yeah.
You can draw on different sources to sort of seek for direction within the different Christian denominations. I wonder if you would talk to me about how you connect that with the work you do. You founded the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, and what made you put those two things together?
So I maybe I have to back up a little bit if that's okay. So
Please.
In 1998 to 2002, or 1999 to 2002, I was eventually the academic coordinator at the UAE Military Academy. That's the United Arab Emirates, in the Gulf, right beside Saudi Arabia, the Middle East. And that was the year 9/11 happened. And, I was responsible for a lot of teachers' families, and, we had to deal with keeping them safe. We had 20,000 Afghans living in our town. And so it was a, challenging year. And that year when Ramadan came, it was lots of emotion, but I was sitting on my balcony in the early morning, when everybody could just wake up and eat, and nobody did. They were all migrating to this big field, an open field that is an open air mosque that mostly men and boys went to and prayed, and the women were back home cooking the break the fast Eid celebration. And I realized that religion and religious freedom and religion itself is guided so much socially, because these were people, there was no announcement to go there to pray. Everybody knew it. They were from all kinds of different countries. Mm-hmm. And I saw this flood of people moving. I thought, there's a whole social force that puts people on a track in religion or life that maybe makes them open or not open to considering other points of view, other religious points of view. And so when I came back to the US and did a PhD, I wanted to study restrictions on religion. And I saw that, coming from working in communism, and, that was the thought that, governments restrict religious freedom. But I saw the social aspects restricting religious freedom. And so when for my PhD, I developed measures measuring government restrictions on religion and social restrictions on religion. And the two of those then combined to really define what religious freedom is for someone. It's the social constraints and also the legal constraints or openness. And so I developed measures, and once you measure something, then you can see how it relates to other things like the economy. So I, did that. Then I was hired at the Pew Research Center that you mentioned, and really started the global study of religious freedom, restrictions on religious freedom coming from governments and societies at Pew. And after about 8 years of doing that, and seeing that the trends were not getting better, I just thought the current way of trying to advance religious freedom for everyone is not working. And even the latest data from Pew that just came out in December, 97% of countries, um, religious groups experience harassment in 97% of countries, and that's up from the previous years.
Mm-hmm.
So every year it's just so widespread and getting worse. And so many of the efforts are changing a law here or there, but if society doesn't change, then the laws, if they aren't enforced or if they're not respected or they're just ignored, don't matter as much. So how can you get a society to change and not just change, some laws? And so then I saw, well, there's the connection between where there's more religious freedom, there's more sustainable development, better environment, and more peace, for better environment for business to grow and be sustainable. And and then I thought, well, it's really in business's interest that
Yeah.
that we have religious freedom. So how come business isn't out there at the forefront? And why don't you see that? So that's really been my mission is, how can you make the case to business, and what in practical terms can business do? Um, and
Well,
yeah,
have you been able to draw any conclusions about why that is? I think most people running a business, and if religion comes up, they're like, well, that's not what we're about. But
yeah,
this idea that they, in the society where they do their business, might want to encourage religious freedom because it's helpful to them, if not just to mankind in general. What are
yeah.
the? Have you been able to put your finger on what elements cause that? Why is that true?
Yeah, so if you sort of on two levels in a community, if you have take Northern Ireland, where the Protestants and Catholics,
Mm, yeah.
were literally at war with each other for so many years, you can't do business, and
Hmm.
it's just a conflict situation. So there was no real religious freedom; it was religious conflict. So if you don't have mutual understanding, mutual respect, um, you won't have a peaceful environment, and you can't have development.
Yeah.
So that's on one level, but that's sort of macro social level, and even at the international level. But at the business level, when you have to go to work, and if you're beside somebody who's a Muslim and your other coworker is a Sikh and somebody else is an atheist, um, if you go into that work environment and think, "Whoa, I'm not sure about these other people," I don't think they're against me and my religion. I'm pretty sure, so I'm just going to back off a little bit and be standoffish. That's not a very good works. That's not good teamwork. That,
Yeah.
and if you're in a situation you're thinking that and feeling that, you're not going to be open, and you're probably thinking, I'm going to find some place where there's more people like me, whatever my identity is, to work. And that's really what businesses have discovered, is that if their workplace is a place where someone's core identity, whether that's being male or female, or being black or white, or being um, you know young or old, or being of this religion, that religion, or no religion, if you don't feel like this is a place where you're valued and welcomed, and then you're going to be looking for another job or not working as hard as you could. So right there, when you feel like you belong, you're going to work harder. You're going to want to stay longer. So you've got retention. You've got more productivity. It's easier to recruit people into an environment like that because they
Mm.
think, oh, I can fit in there. And then that's all good for the bottom line of business.
So does
So
this?
when you, yeah,
Well, does how, I guess I'm asking, how hard do you have to work to persuade people? Or once you start talking about this in the business setting, does it just make sense?
It makes sense. So, we're in a current political environment, and for those that are, following the news, there's sort of a real backlash against DEI,
Yeah.
diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is at a, there's a lot of politics and culture war stands around that. But at its basic, it's the idea that companies have that you want to make a workplace where people feel like they belong and want to work hard and do their best for the company and work well with their colleagues and feel like, this is a place they can thrive. So these policies I just described are things that really make a workplace that way. So making the argument about religion in that environment where people recognize this is important, everybody historically is afraid of religion. It's like, well,
Yeah.
that's, it's the two things we don't talk about, religion and politics. And so let's just keep those out because that'll be too divisive. But really, it's when you try to keep things out and don't talk about them and push them under the table, that's when they become more divisive. Um, so that's the work that I do, working with companies as diverse as Google and Tyson Foods and American Airlines and Intel Corporation. So all of these companies have embraced these kind of policies and see business success in it. And for companies like there's a global consulting company, Accenture, with nearly 800,000 employees worldwide. They view it as a cult, that's how they define their workplace culture. What it means to work in this company is to work in an environment where your deeply held beliefs and identities and core identities are welcome, celebrated, and valued.
You bring up we could take you, obviously you teach whole courses, and I probably love being in a 10-week course with you. Our time is limited. I want to jump to a concept you talk about, building religious freedom or advocating for it. And you say there's a difference. What is that?
Yeah, so it comes a little bit like I've drawn this picture of religious freedom can be limited by things governments and laws do versus things that groups in society and culture does.
Hmm.
So if you want to advocate for something, um, that's generally been taken in religious freedom circles to be something that lawyers do. They're going to fight for changing this law or that zoning standard, or
Hmm.
fight battles, and all that's important. But it doesn't um, build a culture, build a consensus that these are good things. So to build religious freedom means expanding the space where faith and people of faith and their viewpoints are welcome. And so that's, if you think of the potential business, if you could get every workplace in the world to make their workplaces accommodating and welcoming to people of differing faiths and beliefs, that would be build religious freedom for billions of workers worldwide. So
Yeah.
that's the potential. That, when you think of building something, and that's what businesses do. They build things and they're good at that. And so I think just that concept of building something that's positive, we're not fighting against the enemy, but we're building things that people can join and anybody can do it. You don't have to have a law degree to do it, so to speak.
It seems less adversarial. Like, here is this
Yeah.
positive, rather than I want to stop this or stop these people or get those people to change their minds. How could they think what they think? Instead, to say, here's this positive good that I want to encourage.
Yeah, and I think one of the critical things though is all start to realize in that you don't have to give up your beliefs.
Mm,
Whatever your deeply held beliefs are, I might not agree with them, and we don't have to agree that what you believe and what I believe are equally right, but we need to both agree that it's really important that you have the right to believe what you believe, and vice versa. So I think that's that's the secret to this. It's not homogenizing everybody, but letting those differences flourish and sort of knock up against each other. So, I'll give one example from a Sikh friend I have. We had a lunch together, and we were talking, about different beliefs. And she said, well, we Sikhs, we don't believe in miracles. Oh, I said, really? She said, no, we rely on them. And, and it's just such a, there's a lot of, like, Sikhs don't believe in fasting. They don't see that as part of their religious, something they're called to. Catholics fast, Latter-day Saints have fasts, there's built in. So we don't agree on that, and we don't have to, but we can certainly be edified and encouraged by those truly, maybe it's fun or maybe it's deeply spiritual aspects that we find in others.
Thank you very much. I also want to jump to there's the famous Brothers Grimm, in this case with two M's.
Yeah.
Maybe because there were two of them. But you have one M, but you and your wife have worked together, and she coordinates study abroad for the Navy, and together you have authored Grimm's New Fairy Tales of Love Overcoming Evil. I wonder can you tell me about that? And is there a new fairy tale you can share with me? I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
Well, I wrote an article recently on Patheos. I don't know if you're familiar with that platform. It's a place for people of different faiths to share ideas. And I shared about how when I went on a music fast for 10 months, it changed my life. And,
wow.
It was after becoming Catholic. I had been sort of in a evangelical Protestant church that, there was lots of repetitive praise songs. And, that was sort of the diet that I had. And then when another miraculous time when God called us back into China, we went back to China and we decided to leave our CD player behind. And this was in 1994. So it was, there was no internet, there was no way to get music, no Spotify or anything like that. And so we decided to leave it behind, and we went without all of that music for 10 months. And I became a poet. And it was just like all of this, and I'd never really written any poetry. It was just alien to me. I hadn't read poetry. And then all of a sudden, all this beautiful poetry came out. And the fairy tales, half of them are story poems. Sort of like, "'Twas the night before Christmas and all through the house, not a creature was stirring." So they have that kind of lyrical storytelling. And that all came out during this religious transformation that was also coinciding with this fasting from this other soundtrack of life. So it came, it was a way for us to process. So a lot of the poems were even just processing what we had encountered in that the things that pushed us away from what we were and the pole we were going. And we had some family members that disowned us, people who, when we became Catholic, said, "Oh, you're no longer Christian. You're going to hell now, and your children are lost." And and there, there's even worse things. So, it was a very difficult thing. And the fairy tales came out of that. And so my wife, one of our first years being Catholic was in China, then Saudi Arabia. And so as I wrote these story poems, she had these stories she wanted to tell. And she wrote one, and she didn't know where to go next. So I just wrote a bunch of titles and said, "Here's the title. The puppy who was a boy." And then she just wrote the story. But and the one was The Architect and the Artist. And that whole fairy tale is really a recount of the journey that she had in in sort of breaking away from some things that were really destructive in her background. So the fairy tales really came out of that religious conversion, though they don't mention, it's not like they're religious, like we're not trying to promote any kind of religious um, doctrine in them, other than they came from our deep religious experience. And then we process that by in my case, writing poetry, in my wife's case, writing regular tales.
We have asked certain guests if they experience their faith differently, especially, for instance, if you're a Muslim and you live in a majority Muslim country, it's built into the culture, as you said, the early morning call to prayer and throughout the day. And there are times when many people will just stop, or society builds their day off around the Friday prayers or whatever it might be. But then if you are a Muslim and you go to a place where you're the minority, society is not built to cater to you. And what experience did you have as a practicing Christian being in China or in Russia or in majority Muslim countries, various places where you truly were the minority? How did that affect your faith or your observance?
Yeah, I'll give two examples. One in Saudi Arabia, where being anything other than state approved Muslim and being affiliated with that and practicing that is illegal.
Hmm.
Was illegal at that time. It changed a little bit, but it's still very restrictive. So in that country, I was working there for a year with the family, and I couldn't. At Christmas time, the boss came around and said, "If anybody even mentions the word Christmas, you'll be fired. You'll have to pay for your whole family's tickets out of the country. You'll lose 2 months' salary, and good riddance."
Wow.
And whereas in the United Arab Emirates, I mentioned I was there during 9/11, and when I came, I was the academic coordinator and for certain subjects. And when the general called us in to work on escape plans and keeping everybody safe, because the Afghans had previously rioted in the city, the prayer call went off.
Hmm.
And at that moment, the general looked over to the sergeant who had been serving us tea and said, "You're better at this. You come up and lead the prayer." And so the sergeant came up, and then the general looked at me and said, "Well, I know you're Christian, but please join us. We're happy to have you here."
Hmm.
And right in that moment, where 9/11 had just happened, we didn't know if planes were going to hit every big building in the world, and we were surrounded in a Muslim area, and being a religious minority, but being cared for
Hmm.
by the majority, is what really propelled me on this course of why religious freedom in the workplace is so important. Because right there, I was welcomed. I wasn't made to become a Muslim, but they respected and welcomed me as
Yeah.
a religious minority. So I think um, that's a little different answer than the question you were asking, but it's an example of how important it is as a religious minority to be given that space and recognition. And when you receive it, it makes a world of difference.
So has that influenced you now that you're back in the States to be more aware of the minority and
Yeah,
making place and being welcoming to those who do believe differently than you?
yeah, and I think that's really a calling that Christians have. Is it's the largest single block of faith in the United States. Is to love our neighbor and
Hmm.
to do unto others as we would have them do unto to us. And I, if I go back to that UAE example, that's how they welcomed me, and I really wanted that.
Yeah.
So the Muslim in our country would really want that in a similar way.
Thank you so much. I wonder, just in our closing minutes here, if I could ask what things, whether it's a practice, an attitude, a scripture, or anything, is like a touchstone, or what makes you feel connected in your daily walk with the divine?
Um, I think it's the two things. One is sort of the universality of the Catholic faith, knowing that Mass is being said every hour of every day, all around the world,
Hmm.
same scriptures. So there's a certain connectedness among all that diversity, and I would say the other thing is just some of the some of the physical things that there's many ways I could answer this, but like for Catholics to cross themselves,
Hmm.
which I just did, um, is something that's very meaningful. There's often you just feel like you need to have some physical expression
Hmm.
of what's so deep inside of you. And so whether that's like in a charismatic movement, lifting your arms up and praying, or but I think that some of those the liturgy, the movements that we do, the certain practices also are a benefit. So I mean, there's many other things I could say, but those two things, are two things that I think about quite frequently.
And you tell me if you're comfortable with this, but I have learned a lot by asking Catholic believers if there is a particular saint or saints that they feel close to or relate to.
That's an interesting question, being a Catholic convert who didn't grow up with all of the teachings of the saints.
Hmm.
Um, so I would say I'll answer it in a different way. The saint who has impacted me through the teachings and the charism, or the way that they're called, is Saint Ignatius of Loyola,
Hmm.
the founder of the Jesuits.
Yes.
So Pope Francis is a Jesuit. So I can't say that I particularly feel close to him, but I certainly feel close to the vocation of a Jesuit, the calling, the life, and the different practices. So one of theirs is to do the daily examen. It's a prayer where you just go through 5 steps, being present in God's presence, reviewing the day, then realizing where you may have missed God, where you've seen God, where you may have missed God, and then thinking the last step of the prayer is to commit yourself to seeing God in the next day. So I think that's what he taught his followers, and every Jesuit ends every day with that that pattern of prayer. So I feel very close to that spirituality.
That's a beautiful tradition. And I think I don't have to be Catholic to follow that.
No, it works. It's something anybody can do from any faith.
Dr. Brian Grimm is an author. He's a teacher. He's the founding president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. Is there something I should have asked you I don't know to ask? Or something
Well,
you'll think, well, I
so
wish we'd gotten around to this or that?
maybe you might want to ask, since many of your audience members are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what it is I might find interesting and inspiring within your tradition.
Sure, sure.
So I think one of the I've been so impressed with um, the volunteer aspect of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day
Mm.
Saints. And people are called, I use that word a little differently, but, when you have a church calling, that's like, maybe it's a bishop and you're asked to do another 40-hour job in addition to your regular 40-hour a
Yeah.
week job.
And for
And
people who don't know, that means it's a lay organization, and you've been called for a period of time to serve as the congregational leader, for instance,
that's right.
or as I do, play the piano for the kids when they sing. Right now is my current one, whatever it might be.
Yeah. And I'm just so impressed with how responsive people are to see God in that calling. And some of them are really difficult, like to be called as a mission president is probably the
Mm.
most challenging calling, because you have to go for 3 years and never come back to your home and be on site to supervise missionaries in a location. And there's not a whole lot of people who aren't Latter-day Saints who would say, yeah, I'll do that. So, there's just so much I see in the willingness and the spirit of people in your church to answer those kind of callings.
Oh, thank you. That's a kind observation. I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much, Brian, for speaking with me today in good faith.
Thank you.